This is Talking Rackheads. Hi, I'm Nigel from The Art of Sound, and this is another packed to the brim episode of Talking Rackheads. I've received a lot of feedback from people, and I really do appreciate all of it. One of the things that I was asked was if I'd ever considered doing a monologue at the beginning of each show. You know, sort of like a David Letterman kind of thing. No. Heck no. Let's get on with the show. Now, the first item is something about these creatures who live in your garden. Oh, no, I know. This is the Gnome from Southpole. Now, this is not going to be an in-depth look at the Gnome. I'm going to be looking at this along with a few more of Southpole's amazing plugins next week or possibly the week after. But I wanted to show you this particular module because it really is incredibly useful. Now, in my hardware rack, I have these all-in-one voices, like a little package made up of everything you need to generate a synth voice. I've got the Atlantis, I've got a couple of Tone Stars, and I find myself using them all the time when I just want a really, straightforward, quick, easy to set up entire synth voice, because that's what the Gnome is. It's a VCO, it's got an LFO, it's got a filter, it's got an envelope, it's got lots of patch points, it's got a sub-oscillator, it can take an external input, you can do PWM modulation, you can add FM, it's got outputs that allow you to separate the items up, it's got inputs so you can add things into it, you can cross-patch it to get all sorts of effects. The filter, for example, you can modify it with either the ADSR, leave it as it is, or use the LFO to modulate it. There are so many little possibilities in such a small little module. Yet, I find myself when I'm creating something and I want to quickly grab a synth voice, I tend to go for the Gnome now. I just load it in and it's ready to go. And I can quickly configure it and I don't have to sit there patching things together in order to get that sudden idea in my head out into the mix. So this is what the Gnome is. A great little completely self-contained synth voice. And as I said, this is not an in-depth look at it, but I'm just going to play you a little piece I put together in about 15 minutes a short while ago using the Gnome as the only synth voices in it, apart from a bass drum and a bit of hi-hat. Everything else you hear is the Gnome. And here's the patch. As I said, just using the Gnome, there's 3 of them to play 3 voices, a couple of sequencers, a good old Turing machine, bit of quantization, kick drum, closed hi-hats, bit of delay, bit of reverb, that's it. Basically everything you're hearing is the Gnomes. And again, this was put together in about 15 minutes because it's so simple just to grab this, plonk it in, set it up, and away you go. So here's a little taste of what it can do. go. The Gnome. All that modulation, all the stuff that was going on, the filter envelopes, the in time of the sequencer bits, all done from inside the Gnome itself. All I was doing was just opening and closing the volume, just moving up and down and mixing it live. Everything else was being done by the Gnome through the sequencers. Really, really nice little module and a great idea, Gerhardt. Really nice to see somebody doing an all-in-one module that you can just fit in. It's not only good for beginners because they don't have to worry about how they wire everything up. It's already sort of pre-wired. But even for seasoned veterans, it's really nice to be able to just grab an entire voice, stick it in, try something out, and then maybe keep that, which is actually what I've found myself doing, or then build a bigger voice to replace it. But again, in truth, I've found myself using this 3 or 4 times a day when building projects. And most of the time, I'm actually keeping it in there because it is a really, really nice synth voice. Thanks, Gerhard. Again, Gnome from Southpole. And as I said, couple of weeks' time, maybe next week, depending on how I get my filming done, I'm going to be doing a more in-depth look at this and several other of the Southpole's modules. Because, to be honest with you, they're all really, really good. And if you haven't checked them out yet, do so. I mean, you are really missing something if you've not actually played with any of Gerhardt's plugins. They're pretty darn good. Okay, let's get on with the next thing. Welcome to the first half of part 2 of Building Your Dream Synth. First half, I hear you say? Yes, because in this episode of Talking Rackheads, I'm going to split this part of Building Your Dream Synth into 2 halves. The second half will be later on in the episode. So, the first half. Last time, we built a very simple, straightforward, monophonic, single voice synthesizer, and we used the MIDI to CV interface to connect our MIDI keyboard to a Vesic oscillator, to a ladder filter, to an envelope with a built-in VCA, and off to our mixer, or in this case, straight off to the sound card. So you'll notice I've added 4 more modules. Now, before I go any further, I want to say that I'm trying to build this synth, and always try to build this synth, using only free modules. I'm not intending to use any modules that could cost money. And the reason for this is so that everybody can build their own synthesizer and make it into whatever they want. So as best as I can, unless there's a really pressing reason to use a paid module, I'm not going to in this series. So all the modules that you see are free and freely available for VCV Rack for Windows, Linux and Mac. And I'm actually doing this on a Mac, so, you know, it works. Okay, so let's get on. So what am I going to do for the first half? Well, what I intend to show you is how to use your mod wheel and your pitch wheel on your MIDI keyboard. The mod wheel we're going to use to add vibrato, and the pitch wheel we're going to use to add pitch bend. Very traditional things for a synthesizer. Of course, you can add all sorts of things to the mod wheel. It doesn't have to be vibrato. It could be so many different things, up to you. But for now, I'm just going to show you the basic principle of adding vibrato through the mod wheel and pitch bend through the pitch wheel. Okay, so the first module we have here is called Unity, and it's in the fundamental package. In fact, all these 4 modules are from the fundamentals package, so they're with every copy of VCV. And Unity is sort of a signal merger. It takes signals from different sources and adds them together and outputs them from here. So I've got the signal coming in from 1 volt per octave. That's the thing that determines the pitch from our keyboard and translates it to the pitch that our oscillator will use. And I've taken that signal and run it down to the first input in the Unity module. Then I've got a second one, a third. I'll come to the third one in a little while. But the second one is where we're going to get our vibrato from. Now, vibrato is basically a slight increase and a slight decrease in pitch, performed like a violinist on a string by moving the hand backwards and forwards, and it sort of makes a sort of up and down, up and down, up and down, just a little bit of pitch change either way to give a bit of feeling and emotion to a piece. So in order to generate something that goes up and down, that's what we use an LFO for. And here is LFO 1. And again, this is a fundamental module. So I'm going to use this to generate the up and down bit to the pitch information. So instead of playing a steady pitch like this, it will go up and down, up and down, up and down, just a little bit like a guitarist or a violinist does with a string by moving their fingers up and down. So I've got the LFO and I'll set that up, and I'm going to explain a little bit about these settings in a minute. But I'm going to use the sine wave output from the LFO because that's a very smooth up and down cycle. And I've taken the sine output and I've put it to the in of a VCA. Now, a VCA is a voltage control amplifier. So why am I doing that? Well, VCAs are one of those modules that can do lots of different things. They're called a voltage controlled amplifier, but in fact, they can add things together. They can control the levels of electronic signals, CV signals, not just audio signals, for example. And so they can also act as what we call attenuators. They can limit things. So instead of, for example, the up and down pitch of a vibrato being really high and really low, I'm using the VCA to limit that. So it's just a gentle up and a gentle down, not a very wide pitched rise and fall. There's an old saying, and that is, you can never have too many VCAs in a modular rack. And the reason for that saying is because they are so useful for so many different tasks. Okay, so I've taken the sine wave from the LFO into the VCA, and I've taken the output of the VCA into Unity, which is again merging the signal. So what it's really doing is the signal is going from this LFO into the VCA and then from the VCA into Unity. And this signal is then added to the 1 volt per octave signal coming from the keyboard. So it's the normal pitch plus whatever the LFO's doing, up and down movement. So that's how that works. And the amount, the degree in which it happens, it gets that from this linear input. Now you could use exponential or you could use linear. The difference between the two is that exponential is a sort of a gentle rise initially, and then it gets steeper and faster and faster and faster. Linear is a steady increase from 0 to maximum. And I find for a for a mod wheel, I prefer a linear approach. But you might find exponential is easier for you to control. It just depends. So running this from the linear to the mod wheel means that now when I turn the mod wheel, that will allow so much LFO information to come from the LFO and get added to the 1 volt per octave pitch information. Sounds complicated, but in reality it's quite a simple little thing. Let me show you how it works, and I'm going to play a note and then add some vibrato. I'm sure you could hear the vibrato coming in. Now, I've not made the vibrato too wild and too fast, just enough to sound like a sort of guitarist's vibrato, if you like. And so all I've done now is just, with the mod wheel, push the mod wheel forward, pulled it back, and that adds or decreases the vibrato. Again, a very simple little thing. However, there is one little functionality which most people forget about with an LFO. When you use it in unipolar mode, and this is a technical thing, what it does is it starts from a level and goes up and then back down to that level. So if you imagine the level was 0, then the LFO cycle goes from 0, say, to 10 and back to 0. Well, if it does that with pitch, then it starts at the pitch that's coming from the keyboard and then goes up to 10 and comes back down again, and does that very fast. And that actually makes the vibrato sound slightly out of key, out of tune, because the middle point is actually 5 steps higher than the note that's coming from the keyboard. So in order for the pitch, instead of going from 0 to 10 to 0 to 10, what we really want is to keep the width, like 10 units worth of width, but make it go from -5 to +5. So the pitch goes down a little bit, and then up a little bit, and then down a little bit and up a little bit. And to do that, we change the setting here in the LFO from unipolar to bipolar. So now it's in bipolar mode, and it's the same amount of vibrato, but instead of starting at the pitch and going all the way up and all the way back to the pitch, now it goes down a little bit from the pitch, back to the center of the pitch, then up a little bit to the pitch and back to the center again. So it stays more in tune when you add it, like this. That's bipolar. Let me switch it back to unipolar and see if we can hear the difference. It definitely sounds sharp to my ears, like slightly out of tune. Bring it back down to bipolar. And that's much more natural, the way that a guitarist or a violinist would play vibrato. They keep in tune by moving up and down a little bit from where the note really is. So that's an important little switch. A bipolar switch in an LFO allows the signal to rotate around the original signal it's receiving or modifying. So that's it. And then this here, this controls the rate of the vibrato, how fast it is at maximum, and this controls the amount of vibrato. And what I did was I set the mod wheel to maximum, then I rotated this knob until at maximum, that was the maximum amount of vibrato I wanted. I'll show you what I mean. I'm going to turn the vibrato up full, and I'm going to play a note. And again, You can hear the difference. So this is what you use this for, to limit that wild up and down. We just want a little bit, you know, maybe half a semitone even at most. And then this is the speed, and the speed stays constant. So that's about right for a vibrato. So now if I move the wheel back to 0 and then play some notes and have vibrato, you'll hear what it sounds like. By adding different amounts of mod wheel, I got less or more vibrato. So that's the mod wheel taken care of. Now the next thing we need to look at is the pitch wheel. And once again, we use Unity to insert what the pitch wheel does to the pitch. So the pitch wheel output, when you move the pitch wheel forward, it adds voltage, it generates a voltage, and when you move the pitch wheel back, it generates a low voltage, it takes away a voltage. So it adds or it subtracts voltage. So if we add this here, so the pitch wheel goes into, and this is another module, this is the 8 vert. And what a vert is an attenuverter. Now, I often call attenuverters attenuators, and that's not strictly correct. An attenuator, if I understand this right, and please someone correct me if I'm wrong, but an attenuator lowers the top end towards the bottom. An attenuverter lowers the top end, but it can also bring up from the bottom, so it sort of attenuates from both ends rather than just one end to the other. So this is an attenuverter, and you have to dial in a very, very small amount of attenuversion to get the pitch bend to only be like maybe a note's worth, a tone, not a semitone, but a tone, like from C to D. We don't want the pitch bend to be, well, you might want it to be an octave. If you do, you can set it here, but this determines the range of the pitch bend. And then once that's done, the output signal goes into Unity and again is added to the original 1 volt per octave signal coming from here. And then all these three things, the original signal, the modulation signal, and the pitch bend signal, are added together, and the output from here goes into the volt per octave input on our VCV. So let's listen to what the pitch wheel sounds like with pitch bend. Pitch bend. So now we've got pitch bend and vibrato from our pitch bend wheel, our pitch wheel, and our mod wheel, and that allows us to do expressive stuff. So we can, for example, do and so on. Still not a great sound, but, you know, it's getting there. We're adding little things to it. So that's it. That's the mod wheel and the pitch wheel taken care of. In the second half, I'm going to show you how to thicken the sound and make the sound richer and fatter and make it sound like a much bigger synth than it really is. And we're going to start adding a favorite thing that almost all synths like to use, and that is a little bit of FX, and I'm going to show you how to add those in as well. Okay, that's the end of the first half of this part of building your dream synth. Bye. This week we're going to be playing a game. It's called Add One and Pass It Back. And the idea behind the game is sort of like consequences for writers. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a basic patch, this one, and send it out to one person. And that person has 6 hours in which to add one module, and only one module, to the patch and tweak the patch to add something new and different to it, and then send it back to me. And then I'll take that patch and send it to the next person, and they'll add one module and tweak the patch and then send it back, and so on, until it goes out to everybody and comes back, and we'll see what creative twists and turns the basic patch has taken, because in next week's episode of Talking Rackheads, I will perform the final patch live during the show. Now, I'm not only just going to use one module, I'm giving you a lot of little utilities down the bottom that you can utilize in the patch. So these you can help yourself to. They're just simple utilities like VCAs, mults, mergers, a couple of LFOs, a load of attenuators, some shift registers, some envelopes, noise generators. You can use these as well as your one module. But bear in mind, this collection is for everybody. So once it's gone, that's it. So please be frugal with what you use from this collection to help add your one module to the patch. I think it'll be a lot of fun. Who knows? It might be an unmitigated disaster. No idea. It might be something wonderful and creative at the end of it. We'll just have to wait and see. If you want to play, then there's a link in the notes for this video taking you to the Facebook page for the group where I announce this. Just put your name in the comments for that post and you'll be added to the list. And again, you've got up to 6 hours to add your module and send it back. And as soon as I get it back, I'll check it to make sure it stays within the rules, and then I'll forward it on to the next person. This should give everybody a chance to use it, play with it, and depending on what your time zone is, it should also give you time to actually do it no matter where you live in the world. That's the idea of it anyway. And again, I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I hope it'll be a lot of fun for everybody. So I'm going to play what the basic patch sounds like now, before anybody else has played with this. And this was actually sent to me by Freddie Santa Maria, aka AS. And Freddie sent me this patch because he was messing around with filters, and he and I were messing around with this patch, and that's when we had this idea it'd be fun to send it out to lots of other people and see what they did with it. So this is what the basic patch sounds like. That's it. Just a little bit of fun with a load of filters, and we'll see where it progresses by this time next week. And who knows, we may come up with some wonderful masterpiece, or as I said, maybe not so great, but hey, it'll be fun trying anyway. So again, check out the link in the notes below this video, and if you want to play, sign up in the Facebook thread and I will add you to the list, and at some point you'll be randomly chosen and sent the patch for you to do your wickedly best to it. Have a lot of fun, guys. In this video, I'd like to show you a few things. Let's start with Vult's new utility plugins, which are really good and really useful. So the first plugin that he's released is one called Knobs. And what Knobs is sort of two little mixers joined together. They are both audio and they can mix CV as well. So for example, you could feed them a CV from a Bernoulli gate, for example, and then another Bernoulli gate into the second input, and the output would be a combination of those two gates. So it acts like a CV combiner, if you like. And also, because it can handle audio, it's a very simple audio mixer. And in this example, that's what I'm using it for. I've got two inputs coming from my Wave VCO, and those inputs are in stereo. So I've got one here, the left, and the right here. And then I've taken those outputs to the left and right inputs of my audio device. So let's turn up the volume. So that's the left, and that's the right. Okay, so that's Knobs. It's a simple little utility, and Vult's done a whole video on all these new plugins, going into detail their functionality. So I'm not going to cover too much of that. I'll post a link to his video in the comments below. But I just wanted to show you different ways of using them. So first of all though, let's look at what's generating the sound. And here I've got a sequencer playing a straightforward 16-step pattern. But if you listen to it, the clocks are coming into it in a random fashion, giving a random rhythmic quality to it. So how am I achieving that? Well, I'm using this little module here. This is Hendrix CV's random gates. And what I've done is I'm feeding it a clock from the MSC hack clock here. And then what I've done is I've set a minimum of 1 gate and a maximum of 3. And then because it's random, and I've selected here to output gates by pressing this button here, it's cycling through the 3 gates in a random fashion. And 1 out of every 3 I'm sending to the clock input on the micro macro, which gives it that sort of stuttering, random, rhythmic walk. Okay, so now I'm going to turn up a bass drum just so you can hear how the stuttering works with a steady beat. And again, using the mixer, I'm turning up the bass drum. Okay, so simple enough. Now let's look at the other 2 new plugins from Vult. There are 2 different types. One is called Send and one is called Bypass. Now, bypass is a simple means of turning something on and turning something off. And how both of these modules work is that you feed them an input, you take an output, and then you connect your effects unit, or whatever else you want to the send and return slots. So you take a signal from your oscillator, it goes in here, and then the output goes from there, and it's affected by whatever you've connected to the send and return. just like in a full-blown mixing desk, except that you don't need a big mixing desk to do this. Now you can have as many send and returns as you wish. And bypass works simply by turning it on and turning it off. Let me give you an example of that in action. So I've got a simple bypass setup here with a button. So if I press this button, it will turn on the delays, and when I press the button again, it will turn them off, like this. And then I press the button again, and off they go. So that's a manual way of turning delays or any other effect or an effect chain on and off. Now, of course, this control is CVable. So rather than using a manual trigger, here I'm using an LFO in square mode, so it sends a trigger and turns it on and turns it off in time with the clock, because I'm using the BPM LFO from Frozen Wastelands, which has a clock input. So this allows me to control the bypass in perfect time with the incoming clock. So all I do is turn it on, watch here, you can see the clock turning it on, turning it off. So this LFO is now controlling when the recomb resonant comb filters are turned on and turn off in the mix. Okay, so that's two ways of using the bypass. Now the send is slightly different. It doesn't just turn it on and off, but it adds an amount of the effects using this blend knob. So you can add a certain amount of the effect, or turn the effect off completely, or add only half the effect to the amount. So as I turn this knob, it's adding a certain amount of the chorus and the flame analog distortion to the original signal. So about here it's half and half, and now it's all back to the original signal. And again, because this is modulatable through a CV input, then I can use a BPM LFO to fade that in, fade it out, rather than just turn it on and off over time, like this. So there you go. That's a way of just gently fading in and fading out an effect rather than cutting it on and off. And because it's coming through the BPM LFO, that's synced to the rest of my track. So it is in time. So the fade up and the fade down is in musical time with the BPMs that are coming in. Now the next way I've used it is like a bypass, but slightly different in the sense that if I press this button, it will turn the effect on and off, and I can dictate the amount by the voltage I set. So here's the chorus coming in. So there's the chorus, and I've latched it on, so it keeps on going until I latch it off. And notice this voltage control on here is giving different amounts of it. Now I could also use the attenuate over here to do the same thing, but the advantage of this is I could set up 2 or 3 buttons with different amounts of the send and then press each button for the different amount I want at that point in the mix. Or I could automate this to send different amounts at different times of the mix, say from another sequencer track. So you can add sort of a little bit of in this case stereo phaser at one point in the track and a lot more in another, and then a little bit in a third section and maybe a medium amount in a fourth. It gives you a lot of flexibility, so it's not just on and off, it's giving you control over how much at the same time. And then the last one here, I'm using a square wave output to trigger reverb on and off, again at an amount I decide from the voltage, but in time with the beat, like this. And there you can hear the reverb going on and off. And I can change the waveform to get different effects, like a ramp up and then cut off. So it's gradually adding reverb to its max and then starts it again. So again, it's not just an on-off, it's doing a increase over time and then reset. Okay, so let's listen to all these in operation together, and I'll do a quick mix and let you see how all these interact. I'm also using another Mark 1 over here to rotate the waveform here in the XFX wave. So, here's a little mix. There you go. Just a simple way of automating your mix within a project. And again, Vult's send and the bypass and this little mixer cuts down the amount of modules you need to have on screen at one time and gives you added flexibility when you're creating your mixes. Nice work, Leonardo. Really good. And once more, thanks again to AS for his Triggers Mark 1 and Frozen Wasteland for their BPM LFOs. I mean, these things together are magic for doing automated or semi-automated mixing. It just makes life so much simpler. Okay, thank you very much. In the Facebook group recently, Robert Gomes posted a interesting little video which demonstrated the use of 2 modules from the Audible Modules folder for making a kind of string sound. And although it's not the world's greatest string sound, for VCV rack based on a couple of modules, it's not bad, and it can be used carefully to produce a sort of string-like effect. So with his permission, I took his little patch, which consisted of these two modules right here, and I sort of expanded upon it in my usual way by adding 3 more of them and some quantizers, a couple of Turing machines to handle the random note generation, and a bunch of Mark 1 triggers to turn things on and off. Quick explanation, these 2 red buttons here, they freeze the loop in the Turing machines, and this one turns on and turns off the 2 middle string parts. This is the bass string part and this is the lead string part. And then I'm also using MSC Hack's clock, Master Clock 4, to produce 2 different clocks for the Turing machines, so I get some interesting sort of cross-rhythmic phasing backwards and forwards. Finally, I've added some LFOs to the volume on the mixer, so these will fade up and down gradually, little bits of the parts, to give some volume changes over time. That's all there is to it, really, but it can produce some interesting results. I'm not quite sure what, but, well, you decide. So there you go, little sample. I'll be posting up the patch for this along with the rest of the patches in a patch pack shortly after the video is released on Wednesday. Play around with it. As I said, it's not going to set the world on fire as a string sound, but it's not bad, and in a mix it might actually work in the background. And anyway, it sort of shows off how much the Turing machine can produce musical stuff, as I demonstrated last week, so it sort of serves 2 purposes. Thanks, Roberto, for coming up with this patch. Really appreciate it, and thank you so much for allowing me to use it and expand upon it in Talking Rackheads. As I said earlier, I get a lot of feedback and I find a lot of it very useful, especially when I make mistakes, because, I'm not the world's greatest technical bod, and so I'm going to mess up things at times. I'll get attenuators mixed up with attenuverters, for example, or I'll say a person's name wrong, or I'll spell it wrong. Sorry, Martin Luders, I really apologise. These sort of things happen, and so if I do mess up, just drop me a note, either message me on Facebook, on YouTube. You can email me at theartofsoundstudio@me.com and let me know, and I'll try and correct it the next time. I promise I don't take any of it personal. It's just, that's how things are. Now, I know this is a bit of a red rag to a bull, but sometimes people take things I say way too personal. About 15 years ago, I took part in a roundtable discussion with about 15 other composers, and it was being videoed, and off camera I happened to say, I don't care for penguins. And the next thing I know is, every year on or about the date of the original conference, I get something connected with penguins sent to me. Something like this, or these, or this, or these, and on one very memorable occasion, even something like this erected on my front yard. Now, I don't know why this person, whoever they may be, sent me these things, but every year for 15 years I get penguins. And the truth of the story is, I don't have anything against penguins. It just so happened that the guy sitting next to me offered me a bar of chocolate, which is the brand name's called Penguins, and I don't really care for chocolate that much because I find it a bit too sweet. Nothing to do with the poor creature penguins who have done no harm to me whatsoever. But this penguin lover, whoever he or she may be, obviously took offence at my comment, and so has sent me penguins every year for 15 years. So if you happen to be this penguin lover and you hear or see this video, please note I don't have anything against penguins. You can stop wasting your money sending me all these penguin items, because I like penguins. I just don't care for penguin chocolate bars. A few days ago, I was reading a thread on Facebook where Andrew Belt was talking about one of the design concepts of the fundamental plugins, and that was that each module had one job and one job only. For example, a envelope, ADSR, was an ADSR and nothing else, and a VCA, an amplifier, was an amplifier and nothing else. And this conversation came about because we were talking about VCAs being included with the same module as an envelope. So you had a combined envelope and VCA in the same module. And he was explaining that in the fundamental section, each one was like a little building block. And so the idea was to take the building blocks and build a bigger thing. So if you wanted an envelope with a VCA, you took an envelope and you took a VCA, and together they provided you with the ability to create an envelope and a VCA unit. And I thought, now that's an interesting concept, because it's sort of like a set of Lego, where you can take bits and other bits and put them together and create something bigger, something that may already be created, but doesn't quite do what you want it to do. So break down the big item into all the little bits that are used to make the big item, and then you can change some of the little bits and add bits in to do what you want it to do. And this got my brain going because, well, let me show you what I created. This is a clock. So whatever it is I've created, it needs a clock, and that's probably a big clue. And then I've got 8 Mark 1 triggers by AS, and they're arranged in a row. And one of the tricks of a Mark 1 trigger is that it has a latch button and it has a Vult knob. So when you latch the trigger, it sends out a voltage of a certain level that you can determine by rotating the knob. So I've got 8 of these in a line. That's the second clue. And then I'm using a sequential switch. In this case, the 8-to-1 by ML. And this switch allows me to take one output from each of the triggers and give it its own place in the switch. So the output from 1 goes to slot number 1, the output from 2 goes to slot number 2, 3 to 3, 4 to 4, and so on. And a sequential switch works by sending it a trigger or a clock, and every time it receives one, it steps through the sequence, activating whatever's plugged into that switch and feeding it from here to its output. So when it receives the first trigger or clock, it allows the signal from here through the output, which of course came from this Mark 1. And then from that output, it goes down to a stack by Bog Audio, which I'm using to set pitches in terms of octaves. That's a big clue. And then it goes to a quantizer, an even bigger clue. And out of the quantizer, it goes into an oscillator. In this case, the beautifully small Tiny Saurish by AS. And then it goes off into a standard synth configuration. So what is this? Right, this is a home-brewed step sequencer with 8 steps. Now, I'm going to keep this relatively simple today, so I'm going to stick with 8 steps. But one of my needs as a sequencer is to have odd numbers of steps that I haven't found in a sequencer yet. Like, for example, 18 steps. I'd love a sequencer that I could do 18 steps in, or 20, or 21, or 27. And yeah, that would be a huge row of these if there was one trigger per step. But there are some ways round that. But for now, I'm going to keep this simple and just stick with an 8-step sequencer. And when I say 8 steps, I actually mean up to 8, because this sequencer could have 3 steps, or 4, or 5, or 2, or even just 1, or 7. And you do that by rotating the knob here to limit the number of switches that the sequential will step through. So, how does this all actually work? Well, let's start with just pressing run and let the sequence get underway. Okay, so there is an 8-step sequence. And if you look over here, you can see the sequential stepping through each of the 8 steps, represented by a different voltage on the Mark 1 triggers. Now again, when a trigger is not latched, it generates no voltage, so the VCO is playing its set voltage here. In other words, the bass pitch, which in this case is an A. Alright, so that's the basic sequence. 8 steps. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And at the moment you're hearing this pitch, and then no pitch, then this pitch, no pitch, this pitch, no pitch, this pitch, no pitch. So you're getting that bumping, bumping, bump effect. Standard sort of walking sequencer. And as I said, you can change the steps. I'll show you. So here, in the sequential switch, you can now change the length of the sequence on the fly. Let's say it's 8 at the moment. I want it to only do 7 steps. So there's 7 steps. Or 4. Or 3. Or 6. And back to 8. So that's how the very basic bit of the step sequencer works. But as you've noticed, I've got all these weird little things down here. And what each of these little groups are doing is adding a trick to the armament of the sequencer. Now, I'm going to be talking, well actually using, as you can see, a lot of Bernoulli gates. If you don't know or understand what a Bernoulli gate does, please take a look at the video I made called Nigel's Guide to the Bernoulli Gate. It's on my channel, and if you don't know about the Bernoulli Gate, it's well worth watching, because the Bernoulli Gate, aka branches, is one of the most wonderful modules for creating random possibilities. It's like a probability device. It determines what the chances of something happening and the chances of it not happening. It works on the principle of flipping a coin. So, either get a head or a tail. And you can weight the probability to more heads than tails, or you can weight it towards more tails than heads. Or you can make it even, where it will be just as likely to get a head or a tail. But it's not even like head, tail, head, tail, head, tail, head, tail, because when you flip a coin, that's not what happens. It just means the chances of getting a head or a tail are the same, 50-50 each time. So again, if you haven't watched the video on Bernoulli gates, watch them, because they have all sorts of uses in different ways with Modular. And I've got a whole bunch of them here. There's 8 of them here, 2 per module, and another 2 over here. So I'm going to go through the tricks that I'm going to use, the little tweaks to my sequence, and how these all interact together. The first one I'm going to do is this one over here. And what I've done here is I've taken a voltage out of this trigger and sent it to the CV input on the Bog Audio stack. And what this CV does, and it's actually quantized, that by default there's a little green light here, and this little button turns on or turns off quantization. It quantizes the voltage it receives here, the CV, and turns that into notes. In other words, transposition. So I can transpose this sequence by pressing this button, like this. Now, that's okay, but I want that transposition to happen randomly. I want there to be a chance it'll happen sometimes and not others. So I'm going to use the Bernoulli gate to generate the randomness of when it happens and when it doesn't. So I turn this knob slightly to the right, and now randomly it will turn the transposition on, and randomly it will turn it off again without me doing anything. So that's the first thing. I've got a random transposition going on, which is, useful in certain types of sequence. Now, the next trick I've got is that the switch is going through in sequence 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And this button changes that. It sort of, if I press it on and off, it will go in reverse. But by using the Bernoulli gate, I can make it stumble. And what that means is it's sort of like a random walk. It goes forward a couple of steps and then backwards a couple of steps. Then forward a couple of steps and goes backwards 2 and maybe forward 3 and then back 5 and then forward 1. So it generates a semi-random pattern, but based on the sequence in which the notes are played. But before I demonstrate what this does, I'm going to talk about this bank of Bernoullis, because these are doing a really neat little trick. As I explained here, the latch determines whether it plays no voltage, which is the default pitch that the oscillator is generating, or whether it plays the pitch by terms of the voltage that I've determined for it. So at the moment, this one is playing this note when it's on, and when it's off, it plays whatever this is set to in the frequency here, which is typically the root note. So what I'm going to do is these knobs are determining the probability of the latch being on or off. So this allows me to add a probability of some particular latch going on and off whilst the sequence is playing, therefore changing a note from the root note to the note I've chosen. Now, why is that interesting? Well, it gives the effect of the sequence evolving. It's like it will play 7 notes the same in the sequence, but only one note will change. And then it will change back again and go back to the original sequence. And then it will change again and that extra note will appear. So it's not like it's totally random. It's just little bits changing here and there, which gives a much more musical flow to the randomness of the sequence. Let me try and show you what I mean. I'm going to change step number 6 here. At the moment it's off, so it's not generating a voltage, but I'm going to use this gate, which is connected to the external input of the trigger. I'm going to use its probability to randomly turn it on and off, and then you'll hear what happens. Now bear in mind, it's a probability, so sometimes it may not happen for 3 or 4 cycles, and other times it will stay on for 2 or 3 cycles and then turn off again, or it may come on and go off very quickly. There's no way to know, so we'll just run it and see what happens. So by turning this knob here, I'm going to add a little bit of probability. And there's the extra note. Now it's off again. Now it's on again and off again. So you can hear that the original sequence is still playing, but every so often an extra note gets thrown in. Now I'm going to do the same to the 8th step. increase the probability a bit more, so it's more likely to happen. There we go, finally. And there we go. Now we're starting getting random amounts of different notes changing. And if I add these knobs here, just change the randomability, we start getting evolving sequences. And if I change the root notes, these ones that I've been playing constantly all the time, they start changing as well, like this. And turn them off again. Turn the probabilities off. And now we're back to the original sequence. So what this does is musically allow me to change the sequence and let it evolve over time, giving me different patterns, but the core parts staying the same as much as I want. I can leave these four always playing the same four notes and only change these four. Or I could change these four and leave these four alone. It's whatever I decide to do with them, and I can change that on the fly as the sequence is playing. You could also use triggers to do this, random triggers from a sequencer to activate. So you could automate the whole procedure. But I'm using a manual version here for demonstration purposes. So now I want to get back to this one, the stumble mode, because you'll be able to hear it stumbling as it plays different patterns. So let me just run this one first of all with no randomization of the notes. Okay, and I'm going to turn the probability up. So now it's going forwards and then backwards a little bit. You watch the lights here, you can see it doing it. And this is what I call a stumble walk, or a drunken sequence, where it goes forward a bit, backwards a bit, forward a bit, backwards a bit, but keeps playing in sequence. And a little bit of probability means it, most of the time it will go forward with only occasional drops backwards. If I increase the probability, it's more likely to do it. So now the pattern's got very different, but the minute I stop the probability, it goes back to the original sequence. So there we go. Now I'm going to put everything into action. The Bernoulli gates over here with the random patches, the stumbling and the transposition. And you'll see how just letting it run lets things evolve and change the pattern over time. So we'll start off with the original. And again, I'm going to add a couple of extra notes in here and there. Now turn on the transposition. And now turn on the stumble. I'll turn a bit more probabilities. Now I'll turn off a stumble. And the transposition. And there you go. It's a basic sequencer, but it allows you a bit more flexibility on generating randomness to it, probability, transposition, stumbling, all the little things I wanted in a simple sequencer to generate random lines that remain musically interesting and relatable to whatever else I'm doing in the patch. Now, in the next couple of weeks, I'll be doing a part 2 of this where I'm going to expand this dramatically. I'm hoping to be able to do triggers to go with it. So not only do you have pitches, but we've got random triggers. And I'm also, as I said, hoping to be able to expand this to more than 8 steps so that we can do odd numbers of steps greater than 8, like 12 or 18 or 23. And I've got some ideas of how to do this using slightly different modules to achieve it, but in a smaller format. So it'll be much neater and much tighter together. If you've got any questions, please leave them in the comments. I'd also love to see how other people expand upon this idea and see what you can add to it, what different tricks you can make it do, and also how you would expand it beyond the 8 steps. Be interesting to see what everybody comes up with. Okay, enjoy. Now I'd like to introduce Lukas, aka Synthikat. Lukas is a 30-year-old guy from Germany who studied audio engineering and has a small studio where he records, mixes and masters his own music along with that of others, as well as he goes out and about mixing for various live bands. His talents include building his own instruments, teaching classes on synthesis, and if you're in the Leipzig area, he will be teaching synthesis at the SAE beginning in April. And also he produces music in various genres, some of which he's not even sure their names for. Anyhow, today he is modelling for us a simple but elegant blue checkered shirt, trousers and a cap, along with matching accessories. Oh, no, that's the wrong script. Seriously though, Lukas is one smart and talented guy who has his own YouTube channel packed full of tutorials for VCV Rack, along with a number of tracks he has made using Rack, as well as all kinds of other music made in Cubase, Ableton and so on. I love his tutorials and the style he uses when presenting them. I also really like the visuals he adds to his videos at times, full of imagination and a lot of humour for sure. Here's a little clip from one of his VCV Rack tutorials. Oh, and by the way, I guess Kamel, who appears during the opening segment of his tutorial, was his muse for this particular subject, despite the fact she apparently had the hump about something.
The dry wet, let's call it dry wet of the reverb. And now it has this like kind of up and downward movement where we have like a dry signal, then it's going into a wet signal more and more and coming back into the dry signal. And also when it's going into the wet signal, it's like opening the release of the envelopes. So we have in the beginning we have like shorter notes and they get longer and the reverb is coming onto it. Okay, let me show you this. there you can hear this like up and down movement. The sound it's sounding a bit like it's coming closer and it's going more far away all the time, back and forward. That's what I really like on this patch, what it's making it like breathe. And I forgot one last thing. I used this counter mechanical chaos source. It's also like a random generator with a lot of nice different like random amount outputs. Let's call it like this. Check out the modules of Vult. Really nice modules all, as well. Yeah, let's say typically I've like my favorite modules in this patch. Maybe some are not in it, but the most favorite modules I have in this patch. And I'm using this random source to change the frequency cutoff point from the filter. And also, I crank up the resonance sometimes. You see how it's flickering in the inputs here on the frequency and from the resonance. And this is making this like sweeps in high frequencies. You can hear it when I run the patch again. You hear like this, like it's, I don't know how to call it right now. But it remembers me like you're in the rainforest and you hear like bird noises or something. Let's listen it.
I really enjoy Lukas's music so much that I'll be using an excerpt this week to play under the end titles. Make sure to take a little listen to it. Truly beautiful work indeed. I'll also post a link to his YouTube channel in the notes below. I highly recommend subscribing to his channel and spending a little time watching the tutorials he presents there, along with just relaxing and listening to his wonderful music. Finally, he has a new ambient album due out sometime in March, and I, for one, am absolutely looking forward to giving it a spin or two. Nice work, Lukas, and thanks. Earlier in the episode, I showed you how to build your own sequencer, and while I was messing around with this, I started to look for other things that I could do with it. And so when I want to look for some fresh inspiration, what I typically do is open up the plugin folder and go to a plugin that I've either never used before or never noticed. And while I was doing that, I came across this. It's the loop station from Sonus. And I was like, ooh, this looks interesting. I wonder how it works and what I can do with this. So I spent a few minutes messing around with it, read up about it. I've used a looper once or twice in the long distance past, and a couple of my friends use them all the time when they're working live. So I thought, yeah, this could be interesting. Let's see if I can integrate it into my sequencer patch. So that is what I did. And this is what I came up with. So here's the loop station, or Lupolo, I don't know, 3. It's called the loop station anyway in the plugin list. And I put it in here. Then I added a sequential switch so I could control all the functions on it that I was going to need. And I sent it a clock from the MSC hack clock times 4 and put it together and decided to play with it. Now, I'm going to give you a quick outline of how this works. I've got a 8-step sequence here, so that's basically 8 beats long. And I'm clocking that from here at a tempo of 120 beats per minute. And so the clock divider is set for 1. Now, because I want to record basically the 8 beats and then stop recording, I set up the clock divider here to 8 and took a output from that and sent it to the input of a sequential switch. Then I took 3 outputs from the left side and gave them to the record play buttons on the first row, and I took 3 outputs on the second side and put those to the overdubs sections of each channel. So basically, whenever I press any of these buttons, it will record for 2 bars starting on the beat in sync with the sequencer and stopping 2 bars later. So it basically grabs a recording of exactly 8 steps. And I don't have to worry about timing issues because the clock will handle that. It'll start the recording and stop the recording exactly on point. So that was useful. Then I added a couple of switches here so I could hear the output from this or the output from the actual sequencer, or both. And then I've got a little button here to turn on and off a kick, which I'm using as a sort of click track. And then this little button I connected up to the direction button here for a little special effect when I need it. The only other thing I really did was change out the VCO for the even VCO from Bafako, because I love this little VCO and I haven't used it for a while, so I thought, yeah, let's play with that one whilst recording this demo. So that's it. It's a really simple little patch, but you can have all sorts of fun with it. So I'm going to give it a go, and I've got to say, I don't 100% understand the looper yet. I'm getting there, and so this may take several takes to get it right, but I'm going to give it a go and see what I can come up with. And I'm going to do it, relatively live, so what you hear is me fumbling around, creating loops and seeing what happens. All right, let's give it a shot. Okay, I've set up a little sequence here, and I'll let you listen to what it sounds like. Yeah, just something really simple. And so the first thing I'm going to do is record that, and because it's the first track, I need to record it to the master track of the loop station. That's because whatever you record first sets up the length of the loop for all the tracks. So the first one must be your longest loop, and then everything else will fit into place. And again, the clock's controlling when it stops and starts recording. So all I have to do is press this button, and at the appropriate moment in time, it will start recording and then stop recording, and then you'll hear the loop actually being played from the loop station, like this. So now it's finished recording, and there's the loop. And that's actually the real loop coming from the loop station, not the loop coming from the sequencer. And it's perfectly looped, no glitches, no nothing. So that's great. So let me just turn that off. And here's the actual loop going in the loop from the sequencer. So now I'm going to write a different part. And I'm going to do a little bass sound. So I'll change the setup and write a different part. There you go, just a really simple bass line. Okay, so I'm going to record that to the looper and let that add itself to the main loop. So this is the loop playing. Right, and then I just press this button, and at appropriate time it will start recording and stop recording in sync. That's it, done. And again, no glitching, clock handles everything, so it's very smooth. Okay, so time to add another part. So That's what we just recorded. So let's go for something different. And we'll do something entirely different this time. And I'm just setting these up at random to see what comes out in a second. There we go, that'll do. Let's have a listen to what it sounds like with the loop. Yeah, that'll do. Alright. So turn off the sequence. And I'm going to press button number 3 to record it to slave track 2. That's it, done. And I can change the levels of the individual parts by changing the volume controls here. So that's the bass part I've got at the moment. That's the high part. And that's the master part here. Now I've used all 3 tracks up. So if I had another sequence track, I need to overdub, and that means using these things down the bottom here, and I'll use these buttons to turn on the overdub function. So let's see if we can add one more track. Now, just something really simple. Alright, so I'm going to overdub that onto slave number 3, which is this button right here. Those 2 parts together. Here's the bass part, and here's the original part, and that's it. That's the loop station working. Now obviously it doesn't save what it's recorded when you shut down the project and reopen it again, so I'd have to record the output to one of the many recording apps and then maybe use that as a trigger for a sampler to trigger it during a piece. But one of the great things about this is not only it's fun just to fiddle with and play with, but actually if you're running out of CPU, then you could use this to record several parts and record them out, save them out to a file whilst you're actually playing with the parts, and then just trigger that off in sequence with the rest of your piece, saving you a bit of CPU. Okay, any questions, ask below, and I'll get back to them whenever I get a chance. Thanks, guys. Bye. Here's a quick little tip that you may not have thought about. I was messing around with clocks earlier today, and I wanted to send a sequencer a different set of clocks, but I want to synchronize it with my piece. So what I came up with was this little patch. I've taken a clock that can do multiple different clock outputs. In this case, it's the MSC hack clock times 4, and this one can divide or multiply the clocks, and you can sync them together by chaining them. Just run a cable from the chain out to the chain in, and then they're all synchronized to the time signature, at the beginning and the BPM. And then I fed each one of these different types of clock divisions to a sequential switch, and then fed the output of the sequential switch to the input clock of the sequencer. Now, you could do this manually, pressing the buttons. You could trigger the changes via a clock like I've done, or you could even do it through other triggers in a triggered sequence. So, for example, at a certain point in the song, you could change from a eighth note to an eighth note triplet for your sequencer to play. However you do it, that's entirely up to you. This is just a basic idea I came up with, and yeah, I've not actually seen anybody do this in a patch. Maybe they have and I just never noticed, but this is what it sounds like. Okay, so there you can hear the clocks changing in time with the project because I'm using clocks. Now, if I wanted to do it manually myself, then what I would do is just press the buttons here, or again, I could send triggers to the up or down buttons to make it change when I'm ready for it. Here's an example of just changing it manually. There you go. Just a really simple little thing. But you can create all sorts of cross rhythms and polyrhythmic things doing it this way. And again, I'm using it with a pitch sequencer. You could use it for hi-hats to give you little bits of triplet hi-hats in the middle of a piece. You could use it for percussion. You can use it for effects, turning on gating effects, for example, and doing them in different time signatures during the piece. It's up to you. It's just a little simple patch. And again, I'll be including this patch in the patch pack that I'll be publishing shortly after the release of the video. Thanks, guys. Hope you enjoy it. Bye. Hi, this is the second half of part 2 of Build Your Own Dream Synth. In the first half, which I showed earlier in the show, we added mod wheel and pitch bend information from our MIDI keyboard to our basic synthesizer, and that helps a little bit with giving expression and a bit of feeling to the music. And we added these 4 modules here in order to achieve that. Now, in this next patch, which is built upon that one, you'll notice we've got a lot of new modules over here, and these are going to be adding effects to the sound, to change the sound, to richen it, to thicken it, to make it sound a little bit more professional and also a lot more playable. You know, the basic sound without the effects is very dull and dry and sounds, well, plinky plonk, for want of a better word, very amateurish. These will take a sort of sheen over them and add some texture and movement and a bit of space and feel to your synth voices. So what effects have I added? Well, the first effect I've added is a touch of stereo reverb. Reverb adds space to a sound. It's like when you play a synth without any reverb, it's dead, you know, there's no echo. It doesn't sound like a piano does when a piano's sat in a hall and you press a key and the sound rings around the hall as you're playing. You don't get any of that atmospheric sound from it. It's just dead. You know, you play a note and that's it. But if you add a bit of reverb, then it sounds like it's in a location, a small studio or a hall, whatever amount of reverb you give it. And if I turn the reverb on, and turn it off, that's without reverb and with reverb. So it sort of adds a little ambience to the sound. And in this one, I'm only using a little bit of reverb. I've set it quite sort of mellow, not too strong an amount. I don't want to add too much because it can drown out the sound. But at the same time, I just want to give it some space so it just sounds a little more realistic. I'm going to come into how I put this in there in a minute, but I just want to talk about the effects themselves. The next one I've added is delay. So in this case, I've created what is called a ping pong stereo delay. And what that means is when you play a note, it creates this echo, the first of which goes to the left side of the stereo image, and the second goes to the right side of the stereo image, and the third goes to the left, and the fourth goes to the right. In other words, it ping-pongs the sound around in the stereo image. And that allows you to play all sorts of weird little tricks with the sound. For example, with ping-ponging, it makes it sound like you're playing more than one voice at the same time. And in fact, you can almost get chords out of it because you play in time with the echoes and it's playing the note before the one that you're now playing, so you get two notes for the price of one. So even though your synth is monophonic, it sounds like you're playing polyphonically. So it's a sort of an audio trick. And to turn this one on, I just press this button. So here's the sound without delay and then the sound with delay. Now with delay. And without delay. And with delay. Okay, so that's delay. And the third effect I'm adding is over here. And there actually isn't an effects unit here. All we've got is an LFO. And the reason for that is that I'm using the LFO much like I used it over here to create vibrato. I'm going to use this LFO to create an up and down, rise and fall signal that affects a parameter of the VCV. Now, the VCV has this marvelous little window down here. And what this window lets you do is set up programmable patch points for modulation. Wow, big set of words. What it means is you can program from here which of these controls these inputs affect. and you then add something to this point to affect whatever it is you programmed. So say, for example, I want to program this one here. I press the little button, which are labeled A, B, C, D, E, or F for the 6 of them. I'm going to press D for the 4th one. And then I move the controller slightly that I want to affect. Say, for example, I wanted to affect the pulse width of the 2nd oscillator. Then I just move this like this. And now, if I feed this a signal, it will affect this control. It will automatically turn this control for me. And the amount that it turns the control is determined by this attenuator just here. So in this case, I've taken the output from a sine wave from an LFO, an up and down signal, and I fed it to to the programmable modulation source B. And I chose the upper pulse width knob here for this LFO to affect. So it's going to turn this knob for me left and right. Now, what pulse width modulation does, in very simple terms, is it changes the tone of a waveform. It makes it a little thinner and then a little thicker, and then a little thinner and a little thicker. And it does it over the width of the waveform. So it sort of manipulates the waveform itself, which produces a sound. And if you have one oscillator with a moving pulse width and one without, you get this sort of phasing effect, which sort of thickens and richens the sound up a bit. So let me play you a sound without pulse width, and then I'll turn it on and you'll hear it with pulse width. So that's without, and now with. Without. With. So you can hear that. It gives some movement to the sound. And the speed of that pulse width is determined by this knob here. So I can slow it down a bit. And so it's not quite as fast like this. Or I can speed it up so it's quite fast like this. Again, it depends what your personal tastes are and what you want to use. I'm going to set it about here for what I need. So that's this effect. Now, how I'm connecting these to these buttons is via the new Vult bypass module. Now, if you haven't watched the new video that Leonardo, aka Vult, did, he's done a great explanation of how these work. Fundamentally, you feed a signal in to an input, and then you take a signal out of the output and move that to the next chain or to your audio. And then you feed your effect signal to the send and returns here. So you send from your effect and then return it back to the next one. And this send and return is added to the sound passing through it through the input and output. Just the same way as the Unity added the mod wheel and pitch wheel to the 1 volt per octave, this adds the effect to the audio sound. So this is like for electronic signals, control voltages, CV. This is for audio signals. So we pass an audio signal through it, and when it passes through and I press this button, it turns on the effect, which means that these affect the sound that's being passed through it. They're added to this sound. And when I turn it off, the sound just passes through without the effect being added to it. And again, please watch Vult's video on all of this, I will be posting a link to that, and there'll probably be more information about these in another article in this episode of Talking Rackheads, or possibly next week's one. I'm not sure what the running order is going to be this week so far, but definitely watch his video. I'll post a link for it. And then I'm using AS's Triggers Mark II, which, as you all probably already know, his Triggers Mark 1 and 2 are some of my favorite simple little methods of triggering stuff, turning things on and off in real time. So all I've done is taken the output, connect it to the controller here, and when I press the button, it turns the bypass on, so that here the sound is now being affected by whatever's connected to it. And if I press the button again, it turns it off, and now the sound just passes through without the affecting the original sound. And this is how these all work. So when I turn on the reverb, here's the reverb's on. So now means that the reverb send and returns are sending the signal to the reverb, bringing it back again after the reverb's affected it, and then adding it to the normal signal, the normal audio that's passing through it. And as this is the last in the chain, the two outputs go up to my audio inputs on my audio interface. Now this brings me to one last thing, and that is the order in which you do effects affects the type of sound you get at the end. So you need to think about what order you want things to happen. For example, here the pulse width starts, and then it's multiplied and echoed by the delays, which are then go into the reverb unit. So all the echoes, all the delay sounds, the ping pongs, sound like they're happening in this room full of space. So the reverb's affecting all the delays and the pulse width modulation. If I switch the delays and the reverbs around, and the reverb was first and the delay came afterwards, then the pulse width modulation would be amplified and thickened up as if it was playing in the reverb room. But the delays would then play delays of the reverbed room, the reverb signal. And that sometimes can get a bit mushy. It's not easy to hear all these different reverbed sounds playing away. But at the same time, it can also be a very interesting effect too. So changing the order of effects, whatever they might be, can drastically alter or gently alter the overall sound. So now we've got our effects unit. I'm just going to play a little bit, and I'm not playing anything special here. In fact, I'm having to reach over to the keyboard so you can both hear me and hear me play. So I'm just going to turn on some of the effects and let you hear what they sound like in combination. And you get an idea of how this has affected the basic sound that was originally coming from the Vesic. Massive difference between that and the original sounding. It's beginning to sound more like a real synth. Okay, so that's how to add effects to the synth. Now, in next week's episode, we're going to start adding more tricks and more facilities to this. At the moment, we've got one envelope that affects both the volume and the filter. And in next week's episode, I'm going to show you how to add a second envelope and a separate VCA, so you can have a different envelope for the filter and one for the envelope, for the volume. I'm also going to show you how we're going to add a sub-oscillator to this. So it then becomes the sort of configuration of a mini Moog with two oscillators and a sub-oscillator. And I'm also going to show you how to patch in another LFO or two, which you can patch yourself to give different effects and different ways of handling things. And then finally next week, I'm also going to show you how to mix all this down. We're going to create a little mixer which is going to let you mix the levels of the oscillators and things so that you can have different amounts of this and different amounts of that. And then in the fourth episode, we're going to add in a sequencer, like in the Mother 32. And we're going to add that into the chain, and I'll show you how that works and how we synchronize that up, and also how we can synchronize the effects and the LFOs all to work with the sequencer. So that's what's coming up in the next two episodes. But for this episode 2, this is how far your dream synth has come. If you've got any questions, as always, please leave them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer. Thanks for watching. Bye. And that's a wrap for this episode of Talking Rackheads. I hope you all enjoyed it and found something at least of interest and useful in making music in VCZ Rack. As always, if you have any questions, just ask in the comments below and I'll do my best to respond to each and every one as and when I can. A huge thanks to everyone for watching, leaving great comments, and for all the help and contributions many of you have given me to bring this episode to you all. If you haven't already and you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to my channel, hit the thumbs up. It all really helps. Until next week, stay safe and be well, all of you. To play us out, here is Synthikat and his beautiful piece of music, Strumming Trees. Bye.